Hello everybody and welcome to this professional development webinar brought to you by the Fashion Network. Today's session is, as on screen, preparing for peak season, a retail logistics masterclass. Just a few things to note before we start with our panel. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the chat box. You'll see the little chat feature at the bottom of your screen, I think. And we want to keep this discussion as interactive as possible, so please do get involved. We find that is a much better learning experience for everybody involved, including us here on the panel. Alternatively, if you've got a question or a comment that's quite long-winded or quite difficult to type, you can click on the raise your hand feature on the toolbar, and that will allow us to switch your audio on and you'll be able to speak to us directly as well. This session is being recorded and will be on our YouTube channel at a later date. So if you want to listen again or share with a colleague, you can do that. Also be mindful if you do speak to us via the audio that your voice will be recorded and published on our YouTube channel. Immediately after this session, we will be hosting a post-webinar virtual networking session, and myself and fellow panelists and my colleagues here at the Fashion Network will be meeting for a little bit of a debrief, only be for 15 to 20 minutes, but you're welcome to join us at that. My colleague Mia, who's in the background, will share that link towards the end of the webinar, so keep an eye out for that in the chat box. It would be really good if for all of you out there listening in and tuning in right now, if you could just let us know in the chat box where you're from in the world and what it is that that you do. Just give us an idea here of who we're talking to. Anyway, before we go ahead, I just want to say thank you to today's sponsor. So I'd just like to thank Descartes for kindly sponsoring this session. This allows us to be able to share valuable insights for free to all of our members and followers. Descartes are a global leader in providing on-demand software solutions focused on improving productivity, performance, and security of logistical intensive businesses like the fashion retail sector. The most relevant product that they have is a tool called PeopleVox, which is an e-commerce warehousing management system. PeopleVox is designed to sort of address the challenges that fast fashion, fast-moving consumable goods businesses have with their warehousing, including keeping on tabs of your inventory levels, packing, dispatching, and creating a wider order efficiency and accuracy. PeopleVox is particularly popular here in the UK, and they have such users as Chi Chi London, Ego Shoes, In the Style, Lounge Underwear, Polly, and many other users. Finally, I just wanted to mention that PeopleVox is also an ideal solution for those sorts of brands that are still doing their managing their warehousing in-house, that want to increase efficiencies without having to sort of like outsource it out to sort of third-party or larger third-party logistic providers. One of the Descartes teams, who's also in the background, will be popping their contact details in the chat box. So if you are in the market for such solutions, then I'm sure they'd be delighted to hear from you. Anyway, without further ado, I'm going to introduce today's speakers. So initially, I'll just introduce myself. So I'm Dale Hicks, and if you're a frequent listener to our webinars, you'll know that I'm one of the founders here at the Fashion Network. But joining me, we have Shahnila, who is an independent e-commerce retail consultant with a long track record of helping to scale both B2C and B2B retail businesses. She generally works with this by implementing commercial and operational strategies and developing profitable third-party branding relationships. Outside of her professional career, though, Shahnila has a particular interest in sort of well-being and natural healthcare, and she's also studied nutrition, which I didn't know that. Alongside Shahnila is Zaeem, who has been in the e-commerce and warehousing management space for the last 15 years and has worked predominantly on the technology side and helping vendors to, again, scale and grow their business through, again, more efficient operational aspects of their business. Outside of work, he is a keen home chef and is always trying to cook up new recipes with the occasional disaster. So that's you me both there, Zaeem, you me both. Anyway, so welcome all to this session. It's going to be an hour long, and as I mentioned, we will be having a post networking session afterwards, which will also be an opportunity for you guys out there listening in to ask any further questions perhaps. But my first discussion point, which I'd like to ask Shahnila firstly, so just tell us a little bit with regards to the peak season. Can you just give us sort of like set the scene and let us know what sort of the key dates that brands and retailers need to work towards?
Sure. Obviously, well, hopefully I can be heard. Yes.
Yes, you can.
Yeah. Obviously, it's a very exciting time of the year, first of all, to say. And you know, certainly for most retail businesses, it's the big one, if you like. So peak typically encompasses the Black Friday, Cyber Monday, Christmas, and onwards onto New Year as well. So it's a long window. In terms of key dates, you know, really having plans in place by mid, even early October is the key one. So that's just a date for diary. Make sure all your plans are in place for then. The thing to note really with Black Friday in particular, I remember a time when Black Friday was just one day, and it was the last Friday in November. So coincided, you know, payday, and it would give a real boost to retail. Obviously, over the years, what we've seen is for that window to bleed quite somewhat pre and post, and clearly from a operational perspective, that's much better because it allows us to, you know, fulfill customers' demand. But I think, you know, it's one to watch, because starting Black Friday, as we did last year, like 2 or even 3 weeks earlier, I do question the impact of that and how, you know, how compelling it can be. So, yeah, so the pre period, you know, perhaps there's a need to relook at that and be a bit more enticing with the offers during that time, maybe something for VIPs, for instance, VIP customers. And then post as well, you've got what used to be Cyber Monday, now becoming Cyber Week and Cyber Weekend. You know, so really that whole period now, we don't really see that peak that we used to for Black Friday. It's become far more fluid and stretched in a way, and I think, you know, overall, have we gained anything by starting earlier, finishing later? Probably not. We would probably just, you know, massage that demand over a longer window. So operationally, that's good, but we want to make sure, you know, we keep presenting a compelling offer for the customer. So that becomes harder to maintain over that longer window. So yes, you know, 1st of October, I would say, get in place, get your plans in place. And then really it's all about the communication. We need to make sure that, you know, all of the different functions are really communicating, that they're really clear about all of the plans across the business. And then once, you know, we get into that window, the art really is about constant monitoring, reviewing and adjusting and making sure that is communicated as well. That's really the key to having a successful period.
Brilliant. Zaeem, from your point of view, what's the are there any, well, firstly, are there any other dates that we haven't mentioned? I did something like this a few years ago, and somebody actually mentioned in chat Singles Day has become quite a big thing now. It's obviously more of an Asian thing, but is there any other dates we've missed out other than sort of Black Friday and the usual Christmas and that, or have we pretty much covered them all off?
No, I think we have covered them all off from a date perspective, but I think one of the things that becomes more of a trend in our space is it, rather than becoming an isolated event, Black Friday, Cyber Monday, seasonal peaks become a much longer period. Some historically being a few days over a longer weekend, it now becomes a period of weeks, and most retailers are looking to capitalize on. And I think it's key to be prepared for the long term and be prepared for orders across the entire space.
And what's, from your experience, what's the most stressful peak date towards the end of the year? What's the one that you sort of, you start nibbling your nails a bit, and which would you say is the?
Yeah, from our perspective, being a software vendor, we're well prepped for both Black Friday, Cyber Monday, and Christmas peaks. Christmas being kind of the more generic across the user base. I think we are finding that first launch and that first weekend of Black Friday being the real driver for growth for businesses, where we see most of the volume really occurring. So for those that are listening, I'd say again, if you look at some of the things that Shopify and some of the merchants are potentially talking about, they are expecting that first weekend to be really strong.
Shahnila, you're nodding away there.
Yeah, it's just I'm biting my nails all the way through, quite frankly, because it's, you know, it's such a competitive time for retailers. You've really got to be on the ball with not just what's happening on your site, but what the others are doing as well. And if we remember the last couple of years, you know, 2020 was a huge year for e-commerce. Obviously, the pandemic played into that. You know, quite a lot of stores were closed. So it was a real, you know, make hay while the sun shines for online. And last year was probably the first year where, you know, we experienced a drop off on online, certainly. So and the trends that were coming through were very much polarizing in terms of the categories that people were shopping as well. So it becomes quite a fluid kind of, you know, trend to really watch and see what's happening and make sure that you're constantly getting your site aligned to how customers are shopping. And I think this year in particular, it's going to be tough for sure. You know, we've got the whole social, economic, political climate, which is so acute. People are genuinely, you know, struggling to pay bills. What does that mean for Black Friday and the whole period in the run-up for Christmas? Are we going to see more polarizing in terms of what they are buying? Are they going to be reining in that discretionary spend? So really focusing in on just the gift giving piece and the food, for instance. You know, what else would we initially have in the past have experienced, you know, buoyant sales on that we're not going to see this year. So this year more than most, I think, you know, to have routines in place, practical routines that are constantly monitoring these activities, and then really importantly to be joined up with particularly the logistic end of the operation to make sure that any adjustments that you're making, whether it's to your product mix, to your volumes, etc., that you're really aligned so that you can execute that without, you know, spilling into, you know, disappointing the customer, because that's really important for this year.
And Zaeem, we were talking the other day actually about some of the key challenges that retailers face, and we were talking about staffing, we were talking about obviously energy prices. Do you want to sort of elaborate a little bit on that? You know, what are the key challenges that, particularly with the guys that you work with, the main challenges you notice that sort of e-com businesses are facing?
Yeah, sure. I think historically there's been two avenues to seasonal peaks. The first is still something that's in the forefront of people's minds, which is we can just throw people at the problem. And historically it's been a case of, yeah, sales have increased. Okay, we need more fire and manpower. So what we'll do is we'll just take on more people and agency staff, and we'll just keep throwing bodies in the business to fulfill orders. And historically that has worked. It's eaten into margins, but as we've said on today's session already, margins and the market in particular is so aggressively competitive, coupled with the fact of getting now temporary staff and even permanent staff in warehouses across the UK and Europe is now such a competitive aspect. It's starting to become a real problem for brands that aren't automating technology. So just throwing people at the problem is now a very costly solution, because the cost of labor is going up per hour. The ability of staff to be able to be trained up very quickly is becoming more and more diminished. I think the second avenue I mentioned is the third-party logistics market. So historically, people have just outsourced the fulfillment and given the actual fulfillment to another business to focus on the pick, pack, dispatch. Spiraling costs in general in the market are going through the roof. So third-party logistics operations are also feeling the squeeze. Therefore, as a result of what used to be quite a costly service is becoming even more costly, and brands are realizing with increased volume that's going through their overall order volumes, the actual control mechanism is becoming more and more difficult, and which is really impacting the brand and customer loyalty. So I think they're the two challenges that we're seeing more and more. The conversations that we're having with our customers and prospective customers is that we can't physically just throw people at the problem. We need automation, we need to be scalable, and we need technology to help us. And it's the first time I'd say in the last 5 years where people are coming to us with those proactive thoughts. But usually, typically, the first point is, well, we can just throw more people at the problem, can't we? I think people are realizing that's no longer the problem. That's no longer the case, sorry.
Yeah, and actually, anecdotally, well, not so much anecdotally, actually finding people at the moment it's not what it used to be like several years ago. Actually finding people to fill these gaps is a huge challenge from what I hear from some of our members, you know. But you did touch upon a little bit about, you said the key M word, margin. I'm going to come back to you, Shahnila, on this. I mean, obviously, from a logistical point of view, it can be a huge cost. How can you keep, you know, how can you make peak profitable? Because obviously, what's the old adage? Turnover is vanity and profit sanity. You know, how do you manage that from a logistical point of view? How do you make sure that you are in good margins, and you know this aspect of the business isn't draining too much? To Shahnila.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I mean, look, it gets tougher every year for sure. Of course, there's profitability challenges all year round. They just get turned up to 11 come peak, because as well as the logistics cost and finding people, that whole casual labour market, we find that tougher every year. Maybe post Brexit, you know, that it's not as readily available, so costs do go up in terms of that casual labour piece. But also, you know, it's such a competitive time. You have to go out there and find your customers. You have to pay for them. So marketing costs is a big one, and it's really important that there's clarity in terms of your marketing strategy to be able to get a return on your investment. Also, other things to think about are just from a product perspective. You know, we've got a bit of a double whammy for this Black Friday, in that inbound cost of product. We've seen, you know, inflation, of course, hit raw material costs. So margins for product coming in are more squeezed than, you know, they have been in the past. So if you layer that in with what we typically find during that Black peak period, where people tend to shop more around some of those gifting categories, and particularly electronics, beauty, gifts, etc., and they're typically all carry a lower margin than the apparel areas. So as well as that inherent cost within each product category, you've also got this mix that swings into the lower margin categories. So that's all that is, you know, a really tough period to then navigate through, and every penny counts and every customer counts. And this goes back to the planning, to have all of those you know, plans in place, and then to making sure that you're reacting to the customer as they're, you know, navigating through the season.
Traditionally, Zaeem, what has been the biggest drain on costs from an operational point of view? Is it just staff, or are there other sort of costs that people tend to forget? Obviously, I know your solution tends to, you know, eliminate a lot of that, but traditionally, what has it been other than staff? You know, obviously.
Good question. I think the staffing cost is a very easy, tangible to look at. What's the cost per head? Multiply that by the amount of additional staff that you've increased the footprint by, and it gives you a monthly figure when it comes to what were our increased costs. This is still something that we definitely speak to customers and prospects about when it comes to scaling the business. Are you scaling but also increasing headcount? I think the second more latent cost that people somewhat forget about is the cost of potentially overselling inventory. So without having real-time integration into your web shops, you do open yourself up, and we see this quite often where people say, yeah, we have everything's in order until we have a huge promotion, a seasonal peak, our order volumes go through the roof, and all of a sudden our current way of working or our current systems aren't sending the data up to our web shop, Shopify, Magento, whatever platform the customer may be using in real time. What that ultimately means is that we're showing that we have more stock than we actually do have. We oversell inventory, and then we spend an awful amount of time trying to find products that we don't have. The end result typically is a very unhappy customer that typically will never buy from that brand again, despite potentially being a long-term customer. And then lots of credit notes and refunds, which really, really impact the bottom line of the business. These are things that often merchants do forget about, and it is a real pain point as we go through some of these seasonal peaks.
How and why? How do these things happen now? I mean, sorry, it might sound like a naive question, but why would you oversell? What's the main causes of that? Like,
I think it's two real areas. Number one, it's not having accurate inventory levels in the first instance. So not having accurate inventory levels and then trying to go through a huge seasonal peak on top of that is somewhat a recipe of disaster. I think the more common approach is that our merchants that we are talking to and work with, they come to us to say, well, actually, our inventory levels are fairly accurate, but we never stress tested or been through a situation where we've 5 times, 10x, 15, 20x our order volumes. And typically in e-commerce, that happens very, very regularly. You can come into the operation after a night, something's happened. You know, we had a customer not too long ago where an influencer was caught wearing their dresses. All of a sudden, their order volumes went through the roof. They experienced an extra 20 times or 20x in terms of order volumes. And all of a sudden, if you don't have technology to scale with that demand, very quickly your inventory can come out of sync. People place orders for inventory that's never there, and you can damage your brand very, very quickly.
And then Shahnila was talking about, obviously, marketing has a big, has an impact on cost, and obviously there's product as well. And we did a session like this a few years ago, and this is a little bit of a wild card question, Zaeem, so sorry to throw this on you, but I'd be interested to know, because obviously you're on the logistics side. Is there anything that, like, I don't want to say the word annoy, but I am going to say the word annoy, but like the marketing teams do that puts a lot of stress on the logistics guys, or anything the product team people do that you think, God, I wish they wouldn't do that? Is there anything like that you can mention that might be useful for our listeners to learn on?
Sure. Was that directed at me, Dan?
Yeah, yes, it was. Sorry. Yeah.
Apologies. I think we often find a lot of disconnect in businesses. So we have silos of organizations working together, even in smaller businesses. I'd say even more so in smaller businesses, where we have marketing that are very focused on driving brand awareness and product sales. Sales that are purely focused on selling as much of the physical product as possible. And then we have the fulfillment side, which is arguably the most important element of the whole customer journey, that are almost drowning in orders and are saying stop. And I think it's actually having, just like when we talk to our prospects about having an ecosystem of technology that talks together, it's so important that individually departments are talking together as a collective within the organization. So we have sales that are very much working hand in glove with marketing, and product and merchandising are also very much in sync with the fulfillment and the warehousing. And what we found is that typically the warehouse management system in a lot of organizations becomes the heartbeat of that, because everybody is using that as one source of truth of inventory, and then that can then dictate what decisions we need to make. And I think the more communication internally, the better, but often communication is driven by technology, and without technology, everybody's looking at a different set of data, making decisions on different sets of data that may or may not be accurate.
So you find that happens quite a lot then, that the warehouse management systems becomes the sort of like go-to, which in some cases isn't always designed for the marketing team or whatever it might be, but that's the one source of truth.
Absolutely. We see that as the one source of truth. Maybe 6 to 7 months ago, we were on site with one of our customers in the Midlands, and they said that they used to dread seasonal peaks in the operation. They used to be fearful of Black Friday and Cyber Mondays. And it was only marketing that were the department that really used to be upset that the business couldn't scale. He said, after we put in a warehouse management system, connected it into our overall ecosystem, we now love Black Fridays and Cyber Mondays, because it gives us 10 times the opportunity to delight new customers and our existing customers and win customers for life. So sometimes we take for granted some of the challenges that we fix. It has such a broad organizational positive impact, and it helps that communication and staff morale in organizations.
And Shahnila, obviously we've got the logistics perspective. Is there anything you've noticed in your career, like of things that maybe the marketing team should do more or less of, or for that matter, the logistics team? Is there anything from the logistics perspective you think, oh, I wish they could do more of that, or less of that, or feel free to have a whinge if you want.
It's such a testing time for everybody, I would say. I feel for the logistic guys, because certainly when, up at the product end, when we're putting plans together and, doing our forecasts, typically at that stage, with a lot of the businesses I've worked in, there isn't so much collaboration at that stage, I would say, with the logistics piece. That comes a little bit later, and it's more sort of, here you go, this is what we're doing, and at that stage it's really a little bit too late to be saying, well, actually we can't execute that, because that product is likely to already be placed with manufacturers. So for me it's really about involving that logistic piece earlier in the product life cycle, right at the beginning, you know, to do a really great job. So not just for the marketing guys, but for all of us. And for marketing, you know, to be in the loop at that stage, it's really helpful, because when you're, you know, particularly for this year, we're going to be looking at every single penny that we spend on marketing, because, you know, this is probably the biggest thing that's going to eat into our profit. So we want them right at the beginning, because they can help inform some of the buying decisions that we make, because some of those propositions may just be, you know, too difficult to get a return on investment on. The product guys might not actually have that awareness. So I think there's a lot of things that, you know, could be done a lot better just from that communication and sharing piece much earlier. Some of the businesses I've worked in that do a good job of this, what they'll typically do at early October is like a, you know, a show and tell kind of sharing, big sort of come together kind of, you know, an event that, you know, where people can share their plans, but also do some workshops around, okay, how will we execute? That's a really important piece. And I think, you know, that's a good practice. Alongside, you know, of course, looking at last year's lessons learned, for instance, where did we fall down? Where was that communication, you know, a bit tested? What could we do better? So always looking at the you know, the information that you have to hand. And as I said, you know, once you get into it, you need to be really sharp and moving along with how the customer is shopping. And at that stage, some sort of regular routine where the key functions, marketing, logistics, trading, you know, they come together to share how these things are moving. So trading, for instance, wanting to, you know, now next week we want to ramp up the fulfillment because this is how it's trending. You know, logistics should be involved in that decision rather than, you know, having the piece of paper handed to them to execute it, because it may not be physically possible. And this is where, you know, the customer service team can be part of the conversation as well, because then they can manage the dialogue with the customers. So it's a really tricky time in that respect, but good planning right up front, sharing with everybody, but not just sharing in a way that where you're informing, you're actually collaborating on those key sort of crunch points. And yeah, the logistic guys need to be at that table right at the beginning and actually be part of it.
You'd have them at range planning meetings, buying meetings, or would it just be more strategic overall?
Yeah, I think, you know, what I would do, and this probably, you know, necessitates happening in September actually, is have a kickoff. So 2 weeks ago, having a kickoff, you know, lessons learned from around the organization. So these were the key trading lessons learned. These were the key logistics lessons learned, marketing, and so on. And, you know, you put that into a big pot, and then that will inform your decisions. It's almost like your business principles that you're going to operate your key peak period over. I mean, it could be something as simple as, you know, people were taking holidays at the wrong time, you know, so we need to lock some people in. Who was covering weekends or evenings? So when it gets intense, it gets pretty intense. So all of these things need to be, you know, presented and discussed and nailed in terms of, okay, that's how we do a better job on those things this year that we didn't manage last year. Then you can start layering on, you know, all of the great things that the different functions bring. So trading, you know, how are you going to, over a 4-week window, how are you going to keep the, you know, the change in choice and the excitement going? What are the discount messages going to be? Last year we were seeing 80% off from a lot of retailers. What does that look like this year? I don't even want to think about that. You know, and that's then, you know, how you build a very, very robust plan that isn't just the strategy, it's also the execution of it. And I think that's going to be really critical this year.
Brilliant. Okay, I'm going to move on to my next question. I'm going to come back to Zaeem on this, but I'm just going to let everybody know out there listening in, if you've got any questions or comments, then just do pop them in the chat box and we'll do our best to respond to them for you. Zaeem, so obviously now, hypothetically speaking, we're running an e-commerce business. We're just about to approach peak. What can you just let us know what the key things your sort of average fast-moving consumable goods e-com business needs to have in place from a logistics point of view leading into peak? Do you want to just sort of outline that for us, Zaeem, please?
Yeah, of course. I think there's two areas that we could talk about: the technology itself, but also what could brands and merchants overall do with their current space and their current warehouses to really get ready for peak. And I think one of the things that we've seen working with so many customers in this space is little small things can make huge differences. So having a look at the inventory that you're not currently selling or isn't necessarily selling that well. Is some of our brands will, yes, of course, they'll put sales promotions and peak promotions on those to really drive sales growth, but actually bundling them as part of kits, or if you are proposing to sell kits during the Black Friday and Cyber Monday, so kits meaning multiple products form a pack, so yeah, very common in an e-commerce world, pre-kitting them, having them ready to go in the warehouse, so a bundle that's ready to be picked as a finished product, so you can really pick, pack and dispatch at pace. We've seen multiple brands do this really, really successfully over the last few years, where some merchants will, take orders for those kits, then kit them to order in the warehouse, and it just takes an absolute age when you're starting to deal with 10, 15 times the order volume that you're ordinarily expecting. Another area, of course, 85, 90% of our user base being in fashion and apparel, having things like returns racking available. So what do we mean by returns racking? So of course, returns are a big part of any order profile of a fashion business. But having actual physical storage near your pack station, so when those orders come out, you're not double handling them or triple handling them. You're getting the inventory back into stock. You're making the good stock available for sell again in your web shop, and then you're picking and packing them fast, and then you're actually physically picking the products very near your packing stations, and then away they go to the customer. And these little small details can make a huge difference overall when you start looking at your overall Black Friday, Cyber Monday, seasonal peak business trading. Having the ability to pick and pack faster and having 1%, 2%, 3% marginal gains, we find is huge. A lot of our merchants have actually decided to continue to run with this in off season as well, because they've started to see the value of that. I think it's really powerful. Maybe the last thing I'll suggest on that is start stress testing your tech stack. So a lot of merchants go blind into seasonal peaks. They hope that their current infrastructure, whether if they're on premise and not in the cloud, they hope it will scale. Even if they are in the cloud, they've only really tested their existing systems to 500-600 orders a day, as an example. And the very first time in a very real environment, they go up to 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 orders a day. And all of a sudden things start to break and they're trying to build or attempt to repair an aeroplane whilst they're flying. So I think never be too well prepared, both physically and in your tech stack as well.
Shahnila, you were nodding away a little bit when Zaeem was making this point. Is there anything else you want to add to what you're saying in terms of being prepared from a
I think that whole upfront piece in terms of then having a smooth flow through the logistics is really, really critical, and it is something that every year the product guys get much better at. I think in the future, of course, when every penny counts, not that it hasn't already, those things are going to be absolutely vital. Like Zaeem said, it's not just for peak, it is all year round, but especially for peak. I think from that whole profitability piece, it's really important to make sure that there's a clear sort of strategy in terms of what are you targeting. So where we're making sure that we're going to remain as profitable as possible. There's probably 4 or 5 pillars below that I can talk to in terms of a bit of a checklist of what you go through, of which the inbound, of course, is one of them, to make sure that there's no cost wastage there.
The dreaded R word was mentioned, returns. So do you want to who wants to pick up this whole? I know, Zaeem, you just mentioned one way of dealing with your returns. I mean, it's actually something I didn't really realize myself. I've done quite a lot of these sessions. It's just such a basic thing to get return racks in place. But who wants to pick up and just sort of give us some sort of tips on how best to prepare your sort of warehouse for the returns? I'm not sure what word to use, returns nightmare or returns. Let's use the returns process, shall we? Sorry. Who wants to pick that up first?
From our perspective, from a commercial perspective, the thing to just outline about returns is they are a way of life, sadly. So we'd love to make them disappear, but unfortunately they're not. And if anything, the trend is they every year they get a bit higher. Some product categories, you know, can have a returns rate of as high as 70%. So know your business will be the first thing. You know, what are your different product categories? What returns rates do you appreciate from them? And therefore, if you've got your product forecasting plans, you can have a good conversation with the logistics space to say, okay, if I'm anticipating this sort of level of sales on a product category that has got a 70% returns rate, well, that means this is what my requirement is going to be, although you might want to just challenge yourself on that. So I think, you know, it's being clear about what the expectations are and making plans for that. The other thing from a customer's perspective as well, though, is just being really clear about and transparent about the returns on the site. So, you know, are you offering free returns, for instance? What does the returns window look like? So typically, a lot of retailers will extend the returns window in that, you know, you'll start off from Black Friday, but actually the returns window might extend all the way beyond Christmas. So, you know, that's something for, you know, each business to consider. Where do you want to be on that returns journey from a customer perspective? Because things like that can actually make customers go to a different, you know, to one of your competitors. So it's really important just to be very competitive with that as well, which feels a little bit like you're encouraging returns. It is a way of life. And again, all of these things have to be factored in right from the outset, just to make sure that you still remain profitable.
What are your both of your feelings on charging for returns now? What are your thoughts on that, Zaeem?
We're seeing it more and more often. I think the last few real deep dive conversations we've had with brands who have now turned into customers have said that they absolutely are going to be charging for returns this seasonal peak. I think had we had this conversation 18 months, 24 months ago, the question would be absolutely not. No one's going to pay for returns. It's an expectation. I think, as Shahnila has mentioned, everyone should stop burying their heads in their hands and hoping returns are going to go away. They're not. They're going to get even worse. But I think charging for returns is good on one side because it adds revenue to the bottom line. It makes people really think about returning things versus having free return service. But it ultimately puts the flashlight on. You have to actually get your returns even more optimized, productive, and right. And still, there's a question mark over what good returns look like. You know, we're still talking to some very big merchants today that their returns are very manual. They have people there opening boxes, matching it up to sales orders, figuring out whether the customer actually ever was sent this item, and then dealing with refunds manually. It's just not scalable. You start looking at 3,000-4,000 returns a day, which some people may or may not be experiencing. You need to be scanning, you need technology, you need automated refunds. And these are the things that we often do bring to the table for a lot of our brands. And it just massively helps the overall customer experience and customer journey. Customer returns an item, they get an email to say it's been received. They then get an email with the next steps in the process. So post communications, which is we're going to give you a refund on this day. And then when the refund has been done, it just gives everyone an air of calmness, which is great.
So obviously, you'll maybe tell us a little bit about what the technology solutions that are out there and what you guys provide as well. So what's like a really manual bad way of dealing with returns, and what's like a really, you know, technologically literate way of dealing with it? Can you just give us an example of, like, you've mentioned there briefly about scanning and stuff like that, but you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people focus on the actual physical operation of getting goods out, but then they ultimately forget about what happens at the end when goods come in. And often returns are unplanned, so stuff just arrives. And I would say perhaps the least best practice way of dealing with a return is physical item comes in, you open the box, you look at the item, you look at the packing slip, and then you figure out, is this even our product that we sent to the customer in the first instance? Yeah. And often the merchants we speak to, 10% of the returns are sent to them in error. They just weren't products that they even sent to the customer in the first instance. And then it's just revenue leakage. I think that's a great way of really driving revenue out of the business, making errors, and just really providing a bad, non-scalable customer experience. So what does good look like? It's quite simple, really. We really promote the use of scanning on return. Is scanning the box or scanning the parcel scanning the actual delivery paperwork, and then actually dealing with it to say, yes, this was sent to Mr. and Mrs. Smith on this day by this site, by this operative. This is the reason why we are accepting the return. It looks like it was wrong size. Pressing a button on a return station automatically puts the inventory back into available stock for somebody to buy, and then gives somebody a task on what to do with that physical item, but it's all driven by the system. And in the interim, some rules are set up so the customer's card or credit card that was used to buy the actual item gets a refund credited to it. It's a really slick process where you are just scanning, you're not thinking, and it's very, very, very scalable. As a result of that, you deal with returns quicker and you win more customers for life.
But surely there still is a manual process. There's someone actually has to check the item is, you know, it's fit for wear and stuff like that. Yeah, and that does have to.
Absolutely right. You've still got a physical human that's opening a box or scanning a box and checking that this is something that was sent in the first instance. But what we are getting away from is someone sitting there spending time tallying things up manually, making decisions, updating systems manually, having conversations. The scan is the ultimate kind of workflow that drives the intelligence behind the scenes.
So just so I can clarify for myself more than anything else. So basically what you're saying is like the ideal place to get to is actually you check the item is the item, scan, that's it. Pretty much is kind of the ideal scenario to get to.
Correct, and you check, and not necessarily checking the item is the item because the scan hopefully evades that. It's making sure the item is in saleable condition and that the return is in a good shape and hasn't been worn or hasn't breached the terms and conditions. Correct. And we automate that process. And typically what we often find is not only does it speed up the process for our customers, but they need less people dealing with it. So if they need less people, as Shahnila said beforehand, the cost of the overall return service and function of the business is reduced.
Someone's just put a comment or question in chat box here now, Ashley. I believe we still have to manually process the refund from a download returns report. Is that?
Yeah, I think this is from our side of the world and our technology. Originally, the case was always manually processing refunds. We've now put in functionality in our middleware platforms, the partners that we work with, to be able to provide refunds automated. I think it's a conversation with the merchant. Some merchants go blue in the face when they realise that the customer gets refunded straight away because they like to have a bit of control over the overall refund process because it's financials and accounts you need to get involved. But it's absolutely something that we can talk to you about how that automated refund looks like with the credit card.
But ultimately, and maybe Shahnila wants to comment on this as well, ultimately from a returns point of view, really all you want is your staff just checking the item, smelling it, make sure it's not got cigarette smoke or whatever it might be, folding it and then put it back into stock. That's ultimately what we want to get to, right?
For sure. I mean, we need to get it back into stock ASAP. You know, you can imagine if it's like a bestseller or something, you know, or not only are you losing sales, but you're disappointing a customer as well. So yeah, absolutely critical to get it back into sale. So whatever we can do from an automation perspective, but a human being does need to be involved, just to smell, if nothing else. Are both the shoes there? You know.
And obviously,
we don't want a customer then purchasing that.
And obviously, I imagine the price of the item will be a factor of, you know, whether this can, you know, it's obviously the more luxury. If you're a luxury brand, you've got the margin to play with. It's a little bit more. Whether if it's fast fashion, you may or may not make a decision to reprocess these. Or
yeah, I mean, people's reasons for returning are quite wide. So I think Zaeem, you mentioned about, you know, the reason codes as well. It's really important to get that information. Typically a lot of people put, you know, wrong size, but where you can get the information back from the customer as to why they're returning, that can obviously inform future strategy. But if you go all the way back up to the start of the process, when you're, you know, listing the product, you can do things to make sure that, you know, you limit the returns as much as is humanly possible. The people that want to, you know, buy a selection of sizes to try on at home, they're going to do that. But where you've got good data, a great image, something that tells you, you know, to give it a size, product gives you all the measurements, how will it look on a size 12, for instance, you know, the model that you're using, all of those things, the better that they can be, the clearer that they can be, that will help a customer make the decision whether that product is right for them, and therefore will, you know, hopefully reduce the need for them to return something. So I think that's important to throw into the mix as well. And this is where obviously the capability of your platform, of your website, is going to be really key in terms of what it allows you to do. So that's part of it. And then, as I said, you know, closing that loop, getting the information back from the customer in terms of what are they returning, and if you keep getting the same you know, reason code over and over, perhaps that's something that you can then just do something about as a separate thing.
Obviously, you can feed that into the trading team or whoever it is that needs to know that, you know, we're
totally,
yeah. Because we did something a while back, and it was quite interesting to see some of the bigger companies still don't have that joined up thinking. You know, the front of house doesn't talk to the back of house. It's still kind of like a little bit, yeah. I didn't want to go back to that front of house v back of house thing again. I did want to just mention about that, and I want to talk about it both from a human point of view and a technological point of view. Zaeem, I might come to you on this actually, because from a obviously you guys operate a system that helps make the warehouse run more efficiently, but what does your system plug into the front of house stuff? You know, we did a headless e-commerce talk not long ago, and obviously there's so many different technologies that you can bolt into each other. What do you like to see from a front of house point of view? What sort of platforms do you like to see retailers using? What sort of PIN systems? What sort of, you know, can you talk a little bit about that? What you think, oh great, this is going to be a great client, you know, this is going to be a nightmare client.
Sure. We're very well drilled into what our ideal customer profile is, so we know what our ICP looks like. I think we've got a lot of experience when we first have that initial conversation with a customer to get into the weeds, as we say, of what their tech stack looks like. And I think most of the clients that we speak to are all focused on growth. So we want to grow, and we want to scale in the most efficient way possible. When we start seeing all-in-one solutions, that's when we typically start to see, maybe a year later down the line, some of the challenges that come out of these all-in-one systems. So all-in-one systems are great when a brand is at the early stages of their growth trajectory. They need a bit of warehousing, a bit of inventory, a bit of connection to some web shops, and they're typically doing a few hundred orders a day at maximum. When we see some larger brands still on those types of platforms and having conversations with us, at that point we almost have a conversation with them and talk to them about what wider good tech stack looks like. And we firmly are of the belief, based on data and experience, that the most successful retailers that we talk to do have what we call distributed tech stacks. And what that typically means is that they have best-in-class solutions, very specific business departments and areas. So in our world, they have a dedicated e-commerce focused warehouse management solution that integrates seamlessly to their web shop, which may be Shopify Plus. It may be an order management solution that then does the integration into various multi-channel shops. A PIM system, as you mentioned, that then becomes a product master. But the key deliverable here is that everything talks to each other through integration. But you do have best-in-class solutions across the business. We very rarely find that there's one system that does absolutely everything to the levels that merchants and brands expect. They typically do one thing very well and other things not so great. I think so we really do go through a process of education of what a good tech stack looks like, and we also feel that it gives the brand the most agility possible. So if they want to change their PIM system later down the line, it's not heart and lung surgery replacing a whole solution. You're replacing one component of your business, and it minimizes business risk. And if you look at our top 20 customers that have significantly grown over the last few years, they all have many things in common, but one thing in common is they have a distributed agile tech stack. So if people are listening today thinking, you know, what on earth is he talking about? Go for best in class and get them connected up through an open API related integration, or an integration through an API connection. I think that's the best way to really scale the business.
Okay. Shahnila, do you nod in there? Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would say that, you know, the thing that will facilitate all of that is just being clear about your longer term strategy. Typically, you know, businesses want to grow, and the routes to that growth are becoming more and more complex. So the simplest one, of course, is just do more product. But typically what we're finding is, you know, you're diversifying the channels that you sell through. So there's your own website, of course, but you might want to be collaborating with other marketplaces, for instance, and what you need to be able to do that. You might want to be going international, taking your website, you know, into multiple countries. So what do you need to do that? So I think from a business strategy, to be clear about what your 2-year, 3-year, 5-year plan looks like, to have that nailed, to then engage, the relevant tech partners to then come up with the right solution for you, so that you can roll it out so that it fits your strategy and you don't end up down a cul-de-sac where you're then going to have to reverse out and change things. That's really the ultimate here, because you don't want to be wasting resource and funds on making mistakes.
Okay. All right, I've just got one eye on the clock here, so we've got just under 15 minutes. Just to remind you all, we are having a little bit of a post event debrief and sort of networking session after this. My colleague Mia will pop the link in the chat box shortly. And also just to remind you guys, it seemed a bit quiet today, but if you want to get any questions, let us know. We've got another 10-15 minutes left. Just to sort of summarize then, just as we go into the last quarter there. So obviously from a technology point of view, Zaeem's saying, obviously, if you're a small business, a one-stop shop sort of will do the job until you get a bit bigger, in which case you need to maybe go a little bit more headless and pick the best in class technology solutions. From a human point of view, and I think this is what you were sort of pressing home earlier, Shahnila, is obviously you just have to get every team talking to each other at all levels. I've always wondered, and this is just a sort of feeling I've always got when I worked in e-commerce, is there a snobbery a little bit from sort of like the buying and marketing team towards the logistic end of the business? I'm not sure who wants to answer that, but you're laughing, so you can answer that.
There has been. I'd like to say that that's changing. Mm-hmm. Certainly, the more newer businesses and smaller businesses that I talk to, that I work with, that those traditional ways of communicating are shifting for sure. Yeah, okay. And that's a good thing, of course.
Zaeem, do you think there's a snobbery? The logistics end of the company?
I definitely agree with Shahnila's thought processes there, that we often still today, less than we used to get, typically owners, founders, the C-level that will come onto discussions with us to say, look, we've done the hardest thing in our business, which is design or source a product that people want to buy, products that people want to buy. We've created a really engaging web shop and we're selling and we're converting cold traffic into loyal customers. Why on earth isn't our business really performing at the area in the level where we think it's relatively straightforward, picking an order, putting it into a box and creating a label? We often get that question like, how hard can warehousing and logistics and picking and packing orders be? And often the conversation you have with founders and C-level is, when was the last time you went into the warehouse? And it's like, well, I think I passed through it a year, 2 years ago when I needed when our toilets upstairs weren't working. So I think there's still this general question mark, or do we need to invest tech in picking an order and putting it into a box? But it can get very complex very, very quickly. And I think when you start throwing more volume at the problem and then have time critical deliveries, it can become incredibly complex, and automation really does come into its own form. So snobbery, absolutely, but I think there's also just not a true understanding of how complex those operations and fulfillment centers can really be.
Well, if there's any marketeers out there listening, they always say out of your 5 Ps or 7 Ps, process is a huge part of that marketing mix, isn't it, really? Okay, I'll move on to sort of my next question, and then we'll be wrapping up in the next 5-10 minutes. But how do you think peak season is sort of changing, and how will it evolve in the future? Do you is it going to stay the same? Obviously, we've come out of some weird 2 years of, well, just a weird 2 years, not just in e-commerce, but just a weird 2 years period. But Shahnila, how do you think sort of peak is changing, and how will it change in the future?
Yeah, I think from an operational perspective, we're all sort of struggling in terms of how things are going to evolve. The thing that we haven't mentioned that we probably should as well is working from home as well, where that communication piece is so critical. Being mindful of that, because that's not always conducive to the best communication. But I think the evolution is going to be more challenging. It's going to be more competitive. It does talk to, therefore, getting the sensible, good planning, plenty of time, and then having the data that allows you to respond and react in real time, to be able to be as agile as possible, and therefore to make the best decisions to be competitive in a very competitive market. This year in particular, I think with the whole, energy bills, the cost of inflation, it does feel like the perfect storm in that respect. And I think what we will see is a lot of reining in. Obviously, at an individual business level, if you get your ducks lined up, then you can be one of the winners. But overall, I think we're going to see reining in, and we're going to see a lot of market pressure. It will push up a lot of the costs that we talked about earlier, like the marketing costs, perhaps the people, the resource costs, etc. So, but within that, there will be winners and there will be losers. And, typically people are looking for something that's a compelling proposition. So differentiation against the rest of the pack becomes even more critical. What is your proposition? How are you speaking to the customer? I think that remembering that the customer is king is particularly important here. Are you offering them, an experience that's seamless, frictionless, easy checkouts, plenty of payment options, making sure that, even the returns journey is something that they would, recommend to, their friends, because that word of mouth piece, of course, you don't pay for, and that's really important as well. Are you using your social channels to the best use? What about your other free channels? How are you utilizing those? You kind of need to, look at all of your avenues of connecting with the customer, whether it's your site, your delivery offer, fast delivery. Be transparent about what your delivery looks like, where customers' expectations are, they want it now, they want it in the next 10 minutes. That seems to be becoming more and more prevalent. So I think there's a lot of factors pushing, and the one big thing I would say is, what does your brand stand for? And make sure you put that front and foremost in terms of connecting with the customer to engage them.
Yeah, one thing we haven't talked about today actually is the last mile. That sort of end of logistics. Perhaps we'll have to save that for another day, actually. But that's something that you've just reminded me something. Zaeem, what's your thoughts on how peak is going to evolve and change? And obviously, technology is going to be a huge part of that.
Absolutely, I definitely agree with Shahnilah's comments. And going a little bit further, I would say inventory is just a key part of this. I think of this seasonal peak that we're going to see, that there's ongoing supply chain issues. So the overall getting containers and getting product into most businesses' warehouses is going to be a challenge. Cash flow is a significant challenge because the cost of living, cost of operational business has gone through the roof. And I think it's managing that. And in addition to that, it's space. So people typically are not, space is not a premium in most of our customers' operations. So they typically are at full capacity as it is, and offsite storage is really expensive. So I think managing your inventory levels is going to be really key. There's a variety of tools on the marketplace that can really help with that. There's multiple apps that integrate to Shopify. There's more premium enterprise solutions that will really help you manage your inventory levels. And I think the merchants that really do well with this and have the best and most competitive seasonal peaks versus their competitors are the ones that really manage inventory and using technology again, using inventory management tools, inventory planning tools that enable them to stay just ahead of the curve and ensure that they can fulfill those orders. I think it's just far too competitive to be able to oversell or to try to drop ship or to try to get products in a week later. You're going to fail and fail very fast if you take that approach.
Oh, all right. So my last question is really, I just want to sort of get you guys to sum up, with some top takeaways from today. I'm not sure technology is going to be at the top of that list, I'm sure, but I'll come to you first, Shahnila. Just if there's 2 or 3 things that the audience should not forget from this webinar, you just sort of sum it up for us. A few things you must not
well, we talked a lot about obviously the upfront planning being vital, and that October sort of deadline to have all your plans in place, your ducks lined up, all of that in place, and then the whole communication piece and making sure that you're communicating but in a collaborative way. So it's lots of functions informing the ultimate execution plan, and then following on from that, once you hit that those dates, just constantly monitoring and where you're adjusting, making sure again that the communication is there. So really, really, you know, robust routines, making sure that all the plans are in place, making sure everybody knows who's doing what, and that you've got, you know, your resource, your people in place as well to cover that period.
Zaeem, what takeaways would you like our audience to, if there's anything they shouldn't forget, those are two to three things you think?
Sure. I think in summation, I'd say planning. It's super important. I think not leaving things till last minute. We still see that happening each year, and I'm sure we'll get the telephone will ring a week before Black Friday to see if we can help certain merchants. And sadly, we don't have a magic wand. The answer often is very much a no. And don't take for granted what worked last year will work this year. You know, a lot of merchants will come to us in the new year and say, yes, we got through it, but we got through it by just adding a load of temporary staff to the operation, 3 people at the problem, and some good grit and hard work. Sadly, I just don't think that's going to be a viable option this year. And what worked last year typically won't work this year. I think planning and stress testing your technology is a key thing as well. Just because it's working today doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work with 5, 10, 15 times the order volumes that you expect. You know, how does a merchant go through that? Go through some real stress testing and make sure every single aspect of the operation works. Remember, the key takeaway is you're only as strong as your weakest link, and all it takes is if your integration to your web shop isn't working to the desired outcome, you're not going to be fulfilling orders, and that could cause a huge halt to the overall business.
Thank you. And planning was the key word I got there. And you guys both say again, sorry.
Plan.
There you go. Plan, and plan some more. Maybe that's a future webinar. Guys, I really appreciate your insights. It's been really thought-provoking. I hope the audience out there has enjoyed that. There's a link in the chat box if you just want to come and join us quickly, 15 minutes. It's a normal Zoom meeting, so you can pop in, switch your mic on and you can have a chat with Zaeem and Shahnila and myself and Leo from DESCARTES and also my colleague Mia. So that's that. So guys, I really appreciate your time. I'll see you in the Zoom meeting shortly after this if you grab that link, and thank you all out there for listening in. See you later.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you.